we answer your questions on everything from the Supreme Court to Donald Trump. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses mostly on hard news, and as well as some analysis. We don't do a lot of opinion, not a lot of hot air type of stuff. There's a lot of places you can get good and frankly bad opinions on guns out there. So we try to stick to our lane and do what we're good at. But this week we are doing a Q&A podcast. We're doing another Q&A podcast. It's been a little while. A lot of things have happened since the last one. Obviously, we had the election, the outcome of that. We've had the Supreme Court do oral arguments. There's a lot going on, a lot of stuff happening at the state level as well. And so we wanted to give our Reload members the opportunity to ask us some questions. I've got contributing writer Jake Fogleman here with me. How you doing, Jake?
Doing well, Steve. I'm excited to do another Q&A podcast. Like you said, it's been a little while, and I always love hearing from our members when they ask great questions. So
yeah, our members tend to be very smart people. I don't know if that's whether the correlation is causation thing. If you by becoming a Reload member, you become smarter. I'm not sure, but
it's science.
But there's a clear correlation. Whether it's causation is another question. But it doesn't hurt to try. Buy a membership and see if you become a smarter person. I think you will. Anyway, we got a lot of great questions. So let's just get started. We'll just dive into it. What are the first question we got there?
Sure. Yeah. This one's a sort of a Supreme Court related question asking about the current state of assault weapon ban challenges and which case might reach the Supreme Court first. I think we have a general consensus, both you and I, about which one that might be, the Snope case out of Maryland, right?
Yeah, so let's set the landscape here for Paul. The members sent this in. Obviously there are a lot of assault weapon ban challenges percolating through the federal courts right now. Some of which have already gone up to the Supreme Court. Right, they've already tried to get cert at the Supreme Court and have failed. We just covered Illinois case with their recently enacted assault weapons ban in Illinois, and the plaintiffs there, the gun rights plaintiffs, tried to get the Supreme Court to get involved, but the court said no. And we got a message from Justice Thomas, sort of explaining maybe some of the reasoning involved there, and which does, I think, point to Snopes as a better vehicle for this, a more likely case to actually be the one that the Supreme Court takes up. And why was that? What did Thomas say exactly?
Yeah, so it was a case that was before the Supreme Court after the Seventh Circuit had denied a preliminary injunction against Illinois' ban. So it was at the preliminary injunction stage, which means there wasn't a final ruling on the merits yet. And after the court denied cert, Justice Thomas wrote separately, basically just to say, I understand our decision today to respect basically lower court procedure because this is at an interlocutory posture, aka it's not to the final merits ruling yet. That's why we're going to send this back. However, and then he went on to expound about why he thinks it's just about high time for the court to weigh in exactly what kind of arms the Second Amendment does protect. And he took a couple pot shots at the Seventh Circuit's ruling and their rationale for denying the preliminary injunction. So he sort of tipped at least his hand as to how he feels about these types of bans and his appetite for taking one.
Yeah, he basically said he thought the Seventh Circuit was wrong and that the most popular rifle in the country being the AR-15, which is broadly targeted by these types of assault weapons, so-called assault weapons bans, even though they may vary in their makeup from state to state. What an assault weapon is in Illinois is different from what an assault weapon is in California, for instance, or Maryland, which is where the Snopes case is out of. But they all try to target similar guns, and most prominently the AR-15. And Thomas made a comment to the effect of, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the Second Amendment not to protect the most popular rifle in the country, given their sort of common use standard that they set up in, or articulated in Heller, sort of set up in Miller before that. But regardless, so we have Thomas's view, and we have, breadcrumbs, as we're always trying to read entrails and follow breadcrumbs when we're talking about the Supreme Court, right? Because until you get to that final actual opinion, you're not going to necessarily have a full understanding of exactly what goes on inside the Supreme Court. That's just how it operates. You will get sometimes what one justice thinks, and perhaps an influential justice. Thomas wrote Bruen, after all, the landmark case from 2022 that set up the new standard for judging Second Amendment cases, although he was the single dissenter in Rahimi, the court's last Second Amendment case. So, I don't know. People can guess for themselves whether he's the most influential or the least influential justice on Second Amendment jurisprudence at the court right now. But he did put out, we got his view. No one else joined on that. And his view, frankly, is somewhat similar to what we saw from Justice Alito in the Antioch case in New York, the one that dealt with those Bruen response laws, the new gun carry restrictions that New York put into place. And the court was asked to intervene there at an interlocutory stage as well, and said no. And Alito, again, in a similar message, said, this doesn't mean that we don't agree with the plaintiffs on the merits. It just means that we're not taking this case right now. And so they seem to have been pretty hesitant about taking any case on Second Amendment that isn't at the final merit stage. And that is why, right, you think Snopes has a real shot of actually being taken up.
It's that, and they seem to have a preference for wanting any cases that come up before them to have considered Rahimi, because you've seen them GVR a couple of cases that haven't considered Rahimi. But this also works in the Snope case's favor, because the Fourth Circuit, the en banc Fourth Circuit, handed down its merits ruling upholding Maryland's assault weapon ban several months after Rahimi was decided and Rahimi was incorporated into the opinion. So all of that is taken care of. All of that is off the table, and it is now before the Supreme Court. And as of yesterday, we're recording this on Tuesday, the petitioners in that case filed their final brief. So all the briefing is done, and it's sort of at the point now where the Supreme Court can consider it during conference, or can relist it if it chooses to. But basically the ball is in the Supreme Court's court, so to speak, as to whether or not they're going to decide to take this case. There's no other obstacles other than they just don't want to at this point.
Right. Other than they might not actually want to answer this question yet.
Right.
They might not have enough of a consensus on the court to answer this question yet. Now, that may sound surprising, so with a 6-3 majority of Republican-appointed justices, but it's not entirely clear which way they're going to go. I mean, we'll have to see. And I would note too, Thomas dissented when the court denied a sort of a pre-Bruen concealed carry case out of California years ago. And he made a lot of the same points that he's making now. This is what Thomas has famously described the Second Amendment as a second-class right, or at least the Supreme Court's treatment of it as such. And when he did that in the California concealed carry case, Bruen wasn't necessarily the very next case they could have taken to resolve that. They did eventually take up a case to resolve this question, which was Bruen, which resulted in a landmark pro-gun, I think it's fair to describe, ruling. But it didn't necessarily happen immediately after Thomas made his statement in that case. So it's, Snopes is set up to be what the court is looking for. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take that, though. So we'll have to see. But we have another question here from that sort of follows on with that from another member who wanted to remain anonymous. But basically, they ask a question. They note essentially that there's differences between California's assault weapons ban, as I was just mentioning a moment ago. There are differences between all these assault weapons bans, right? They will sometimes define what an assault weapon is differently. Generally speaking, the definition includes semi-automatic rifles or shotguns or handguns that fire center fire ammunition and then can accept a detachable magazine and have a series of features, either one feature or two feature on this list of banned features. That's usually how these laws are written, although they have some states like California, Massachusetts have added on other requirements like copycat designations. If the state thinks they're too similar to a gun they're trying to ban, then they will say that is also banned. These bans usually also have a specific list of guns that they think are assault weapons. And so in the end, you get, frankly, pretty wide variation between like Maryland's 2-feature ban and California's 1 feature plus all the 10 years of them trying to go after workarounds, basically, featureless rifles and things like that. So that you end up with pretty distinct and different lists of guns that are actually banned in practice in these states. And so how does that play in when, if the court takes up one of these assault weapons case, let's say they take up the Maryland case, Maryland's assault weapons ban definition is pretty different from California's at this point, or Massachusetts. So this member asks, if SCOTUS strikes down Maryland, for instance, ban, or some other states, could that apply to the bans in other states? Because they say, I could see California arguing that such a ruling would not apply as the state does not ban the same exact kind of guns. So what are your thoughts on that, Jake?
Yeah, I think I see what he's getting at, but I think almost certainly it would still apply. Now, it's almost a separate question as to whether California would try to work around that ruling or not. That's almost a separate piece of this. But just as a sort of an analogous situation, the Bruin case. So that case dealt specifically on the merits with New York's concealed carry law. But because, 7 or 8 other states had similar May issue regimes, you saw in the immediate aftermath of that Bruin decision striking down New York's May issue carry law, all of those states, basically their attorney generals issuing opinions saying, our laws are very similar to New York's, and the Supreme Court just said that was unconstitutional. So we are going to amend our current law to comply with what the Supreme Court said. And that's essentially, I think, the situation you would get into in this hypothetical scenario in which Maryland's ban on AR-15s and other rifles is struck down.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the Bruin case with those May issue concealed carry laws is a perfect analogy of how this would work in practice. If the Supreme Court issues a ruling that strikes down Maryland or Illinois or one of these other states that has cases pending, Delaware, cases pending against their assault weapons bans, if they strike down one of those laws, it'll almost certainly affect all assault weapons bans throughout the country and any potential federal ban in the future, because it's going to likely include reasoning that is more expansive than just this very specific definition instituted by Maryland is unconstitutional, and we're not going to say more beyond that. It'll probably be a bit more expansive than that, and protect things like AR-15s outright from wholesale bans on their sale or possession or what have you. So it's unlikely that if the Supreme Court does strike down an assault weapons ban somewhere in the country, that other assault weapons bans are going to survive. That what is more likely, as you laid out there, though, is they will come up with some other restriction that they argue complies with the ruling, but isn't technically an assault weapons ban. Right. This is exactly what you saw after Bruin. The Bruin response laws, some of them ended up more strict as far as gun carry than the May issue laws were, because under the May issue regimes in a lot of these states, if you could get the permit, they were relatively in line with the rest of the country on where you could carry your gun. And the Bruin response bills, for the most part, have made it so that more people can get a permit, but made it much, much more difficult to legally carry a gun anywhere. California especially, but most of them, they added the so-called vampire rule, this idea that that kind of inverted how publicly accessible private property had been treated in the past by saying all publicly accessible private property is off limits to carry unless the owner posts a sign or tells you somehow that it's okay to carry there, which in practice makes going out in public with legally going out in public carrying a firearm almost impossible, especially combined with a number of the other restrictions on like parks and government buildings and public transit, things like that. They ended up with regimes that were actually harder to comply with than before the ruling. So that, and a lot of them are still in place right now. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, like the court's reluctance to take up Second Amendment cases at an interlocutory state, where if you're not, if you're asking for a preliminary injunction and you don't get one from the lower courts, it sure seems like the Supreme Court's not going to step in and help you out on any Second Amendment case. And that was one of the first cases, was Antioch in New York on these new gun carry restrictions. And the court did not step in there. They did. You got Alito's statement that basically said, we'll keep an eye on this and the Second Circuit should move quickly, but we're not going to take up the case. So, so I think that's what's likely to happen in the scenario where the court strikes down one state's assault weapons ban. All of them are going to be impacted, but they will likely find some other way to restrict those types of guns. Maybe a way that actually results in it being even harder to own the firearms in question. But, that's all speculation down the line. I do think you're right, though, that's the closest analog is going to be what happened after Bruin. We could. Next question is still Supreme Court. A lot of interest in the Supreme Court, which makes sense, right?
It does. It's sort of where all the action is these days. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've been, I know for a lot of people it probably doesn't feel this way, but the Supreme Court has been fairly busy on at least gun-related cases. Not all of them are Second Amendment cases, right? But they've been doing a lot of gun-related cases. They have 2 gun-related cases in front of them right now. Mm-hmm. The frames and receivers rule from the ATF, they already had oral arguments in that. We're just waiting on an opinion. And then they took up the Smith & Wesson v. Mexico case, which, Mexico has some Second Amendment arguments, but it's more of a PLCAA, or really not even PLCAA, just sort of a straight liability question, whether Mexico's argument is even viable under basic standards of law in the United States. So that's they're taking fewer and fewer cases overall, but a larger percentage of them have been gun related. So anyway, that's where a lot of, like you said, a lot of the action is there. And so our next question is from our good man, Weird Beard, who asks, what do you think the next Second Amendment case is going to be and when? So why don't you give it a shot? I mean, we already talked a little bit about Snopes. Do you think that's the best chance for the next one, or do you have a different thought?
I would say Snope is definitely, like we covered, is definitely a good candidate, just because of like all the reasons we articulated in the previous question. It's just fully briefed. All the procedural hurdles that the Supreme Court likes to see be out of the way are already out of the way. Mm-hmm. It's a question that at least 2 of the conservative justices think it's time for them to take. So it's certainly up there. Outside of Snope, my money is really on a felon in possession case. If listeners will recall, right after Rahimi was decided last term, the DOJ came back with a flurry of all of these various federal felon in possession ban cases. It's been by far the most challenged federal gun law after Bruin. And so the DOJ came to them with a handful of hand-selected cases ranging from nonviolent felonies to violent felonies and said, please, for the love of God, SCOTUS, we need guidance on this question. This is our most important gun charge that we bring. And there's all these different conclusions courts are coming to. And the Supreme Court said, well, the best we can do is a grant, vacate, and remand. and they kicked him back down to the circuit courts. And we've already seen 2 or 3 come back with the exact same outcome. Yep. So I would not be shocked to see the DOJ come running right back to the Supreme Court and say, okay, we did our GVRs. We still don't have guidance. Please give us guidance. And I could certainly see that.
There's one felon in possession case that's currently in front of the court, right? That could be taken. Moyers, is that?
Yeah,
right?
Moya is a Fifth Circuit case that's been distributed for conference. There's 2 or 3 others.
All these names.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 others that haven't been distributed yet, but there's been a cert petition filed, and then obviously some of those GVR cases will probably come right back and arrange the big nonviolent felon ruling out of the Third Circuit. Yeah. They just heard oral arguments again in the GVR scenario. From the tenor of oral arguments, it sounded like it's going to be the same outcome. So there's just all of these options that the court could choose from. So that, I guess, that makes it a little harder to gauge the when portion of this question, just because.
Do you think that one that's right there and right now is going to be the one they pick?
I don't, because it's just a plain error review kind of an ask. And that's, to me, these plain error review questions in the lower courts we've seen have just been unpublished, unsigned opinions from these lower courts. It's sort of just a small procedural thing that they do in these criminal cases.
It's also a facial challenge, right?
Yeah, and they're asking for a facial challenge of unconstitutionality of a felony, the felon ban, which I don't see. I don't see the justices facially striking down that gun law.
He's basically saying there's no constitutional application of the felon in possession ban.
Right.
Now it's more challenging from just reading their brief. It challenges the permanent nature of the ban, which is an interesting question because that is something that was sort of implied by Rahimi, that maybe they don't think that the permanent nature of the ban is a good idea, because Rahimi goes out of its way to talk about how the domestic violence restraining order ban is temporary. Right. There was some question about how temporary it really is at oral arguments, but that was the conclusion the court came to, that was a significant part of their ruling. So I don't know, maybe they get traction, but it doesn't feel like looking through the case, the plaintiff here, or the defendant, I guess, because he's trying to get charges dismissed against him for felon in possession. Whatever his felony was, it's not laid out in the brief, but it's something that had like 207 months of incarceration as a punishment. So it's probably a very serious, and I would imagine, violent crime. I don't know that for sure, but my guess is he's not going to be a similarly sympathetic plaintiff like Range is, the guy who lied to get food stamps in the 90s for like $2,000 worth of food stamps, and now he can't own guns forever. That's obviously a bit more of a sympathetic plaintiff, which whether the court cares about that aspect or not is they probably shouldn't, right? And you have all kinds of landmark civil rights cases where the plaintiffs are not good guys. Miranda writes, the guy who got us the reading of rights. Miranda was not a good guy, but regardless, I think you're right. It's probably not going to be the one Moya is probably not going to be the one that does it. It probably will be Range or some of these other ones that both the DOJ and the gun rights plaintiffs want to be heard. Although you do wonder if the new administration changes tact on any of this. The next Solicitor General may have a different argument when it comes to felons. I mean, I'd be surprised if DOJ just said we don't want to defend any felon. It is literally the gun control law. Like, this is what the vast majority of federal gun crime prosecutions are, for felon in possession. Right. So I don't, maybe they'll take a more nuanced view, and especially given that the president is a convicted felon who can't own firearms and was convicted of a nonviolent crime, maybe he will have he and his department will have a different view on that particular question of dangerousness and violence, being required for this ban. But I guess we'll see on that point. Nobody's gotten to that yet.
That's it. Yeah, it's an interesting curveball. I do have a dark horse candidate that maybe won't be a full Supreme Court case, but that's the Spirit of Aloha Hawaii case is currently before the court. And if listeners recall, that's the one where Hawaii's Supreme Court essentially said, Supreme Court may have ruled what they ruled in Heller, but we say that actually in Hawaii, there is no individual right to bear arms. And so I could see, perhaps not taking that on, a full oral argument, but issuing just like a per curiam, sort of similar to Caetano in Massachusetts, and just saying like, hey, yeah, you can't just tell us to bugger off, what we say matters. And we said that there's rights.
Yeah, I could see that as a 9-0 case that just says Bruin and Rahimi control, and you can't just say whatever you want. Right. Especially because they were just basically daring the Supreme Court to do that. The Hawaii Supreme Court is kind of just saying, screw you, United States Supreme Court. We don't care what you say. And I wouldn't be surprised if you got, a 9-0 one-page ruling rebuking that. But maybe that'll be the next one, because that's a pretty straightforward, simple. Although, to be fair, I think there's probably 3 justices, maybe only 2, that might agree with the Hawaiian Supreme Court on that question. Although the 9-0 in Caetano included, a number of liberal justices who didn't agree with the Heller ruling, and they still signed on to Caetano, so that you might see the same thing here. As long as they don't break new ground, you might get all 9 of them. But either way, honestly, that might be Snope seems like the kind of, big brain pick of like, it's got everything that they say they want, or at least that the conservative justices who have talked about this say that they want. Whether that's enough for the whole court to take it up, I think is still a big question. So Snope is kind of that's definitely one everybody wants them to take in the gun rights community. I would say that's what they've been, but I don't think the gun rights community is not as interested in the drawing the thin line between what kind of felons should be banned for life. I mean, certainly there is interest in that, but it's not the big ticket item that they're looking for. They want to go after the assault weapons bans. They want to go after the magazine limits. That's the kind of stuff that the legal movement here is looking for. So they see Snope, they see what Thomas has said, and I think the instinct is to believe that that's going to result in the court taking up the case. And I don't know. I think you're right as far as felon in possession makes the most sense in terms of like the federal, if the court is worried about, overseeing the federal court system, that's probably the most significant one, because you're just going to have so many more cases that involve felon in possession charges than you are anything to do with assault weapons bans. I mean, the only assault weapons ban cases you're going to get are these challenges to state laws. And so it's not impacting nearly as much the federal docket and these lower courts. Whereas the uncertainty around what felons can be barred from owning guns and for how long, whether it can be permanent, that's having like much more widespread impact in the lower courts. And so, I kind of agree with you as far as, maybe that Hawaii case, they're just like, hey, what are you doing? This is stupid. Stop this. Without giving any sort of new real insight. Right. Like Caetano didn't give you a lot of new insight. Caetano, you did have some concurrences in Caetano, specifically from Alito, that talk that a lot of people reference, but that's concurrence. That's different from the majority opinion, which just said, hey, stun guns, really it was just about, no, the Second Amendment doesn't apply to only the weapons that existed in 1770. There's 1792, and that was what they actually held. So it wasn't anything groundbreaking. It was just, we agree as a court that how you guys decided this in Massachusetts doesn't make any sense. And you could absolutely see something like that with this Hawaii ruling. That doesn't really give you any new meat on the bone, but just rebukes the lower court there. But other than that, I still would expect some sort of dive into the dangerousness standard. I'm still looking for the anti-Rahimi, right? The Rahimi was all about how, okay, here's an example of what we mean when we say blank check, right? Or what we mean when we say Bruin's not a straitjacket. You don't need to find an exact duplicate of the modern regulation in history. And so when are they going to do the case that says, okay, here's an example where the lower court was using our history test as a blank check, and that there's no historical analog that looks anything like what this modern regulation looks like. So I don't know, maybe they do that in range. It could be something like that. It doesn't have to be range itself, but something similar. There's a lot of these felon in possession cases, as you can probably imagine. But all right, I think so. Yeah, I guess we're betting on felon in possession, and timing is much harder to predict.
Right.
If it's going to be felon in possession, I guess we're saying that they're not going to take Snope immediately. Maybe they'll relist it a couple more times, and I don't know what they might do it, because I guess denying it would be a big problem too, because they're letting the lower court ruling stand in that case. But maybe they will have to take Snope. I don't know, but I would think that some sort of felon in possession case would make more sense. Maybe not Moya, but something else might percolate up pretty quickly, I would think, including the ones they've already GBR'd might just come back pretty fast and end up with the same questions. Because as we've written, and you noted, Rahimi hasn't changed any of these cases at all. So, they can be back up at the court pretty fast. But all right. So maybe within the next year or so. I don't know. Yeah. No. Either way, we will tell you when it happens.
Absolutely.
All right. Next question here starts off with a statement, actually. You guys do great work, from member Julio. Thank you. That is very kind of you.
See what we mean about our smart members?
Yeah. See?
They have smart opinions.
Great opinions. All right. So here's his actual question. With the increased number of first-time gun owners, I'm finding many do not understand or appreciate the significance of the Second Amendment. Are there good, relatively unbiased resources available which explain the history and significance of the Second Amendment in simple terms? So, pretty straightforward question, not necessarily a super easy one. I think we had David Hernessy on the show, on the podcasts a while back when he wrote his book on, the American relationship with guns. Obviously he's a pro-gun dude. He comes with that perspective, but I thought his book was pretty well done and focused a lot on the American gun culture dating back to the founding era and the importance of firearms in American history. So that's one example. What do you got?
I would say, three different Davids come to mind on this question. So there's David Harsanyi's, I think First Freedom was the name of the book. And that's going to give you a lot of the historical stuff, because he goes back to the colonial era and then kind of traces America's relationship with guns to today. David Yamani, who we've also had on the podcast before. He's less historical, examining of the Second Amendment, but a great resource as someone who came from outside gun culture and sort of his journey through modern American gun culture. So I think that could be relatable to someone that maybe doesn't know a lot about gun culture. And so Gun Curious is his latest book, but he's written several books in this vein. And
he's
then
been on the show as well. Yeah.
Another David that's been on the show, David Kopel. This is a little more academic, but he published, I think, the first ever law school textbook. And I know most people probably their eyes glaze over when they think about reading a textbook, but I've actually, perused through it, and it is accessible to most people. And it really is just a dense history of not only law and regulation, but also policy. And you can sort of glean some insights into what the Second Amendment meant historically and currently, based on just, it's a big thing. Obviously, most people probably aren't going to read a textbook, but it is a valuable, I think, resource for this.
Yeah. And then you could obviously go back to the founding documents themselves, and some of the supporting writing from the time. The Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper 29 would be one fairly good example of that. There's also you can actually read like Heller. Heller itself has a lot of the scholarship around the Second Amendment included in it. That there's quite a bit of fairly accessible writing on this topic especially in conservative legal circles. You also have like Costas Morris and I did a piece a while back on sort of the second generation of Americans and their views of the Second Amendment, and some of the debates from that time as well. So you can go through the founders' views. There's a lot of founders who wrote about the Second Amendment, both in the Federalist, the concept of an armed populace in the Federalist Papers, in the Anti-Federalist Papers as well, and also the legal scholars from the 19th century that grapple with this problem. Is the idea that the Second Amendment grants a individual right is not new, right? It wasn't something created by the NRA in the 20th century. It's something that dates back to early on in American history, and the debate over what guns it covers and doesn't cover and so forth has been going on almost since the Second Amendment was ratified. So, there's some interesting discussions of that, especially in that piece that Kostas and I wrote a while back. So, I guess those are the best things I can give you. There's what else? Do we have anything else?
I would say I would pitch Charles C.W. Cook, who writes for National Review.
He
hasn't written a book on this, but sort of his articles that he's written over the years, he is pretty good on this stuff, detailing some of the founding era arguments and chronicling some of that stuff as well. So if you have access to online news sites and stuff, you can get some of that information there as well.
Yeah, I mean, these are if you're looking for a countervailing view. Which I don't think is exactly what you're looking for, but there's like Gunfight by Adam Winkler. There's a number of liberal academics who've tried to look at the history as well. So it's always a good idea to have a little more variety in your reading too, to try and challenge your ideas and cut through, be informed. That's all. But yeah, there's a lot of good resources out there on this front. I don't know that there's a specific. It's harder when you're talking about like somebody who doesn't have any point of view on it, right? I mean, other than just reading the founding documents themselves and some of the founders' writings on the Second Amendment, because there were a number of founders that wrote at length about the Second Amendment, about the right to keep and bear arms, and reading first documents is always kind of the best. It is usually better if you have some guidance from somebody like David Kopel in a history book, or some of his counterparts on the left and their views. But it's always. I don't know that there's any like nonpartisan, somebody that doesn't have any view on the subject out there. Right. Maybe the Constitution Center in Philadelphia or somebody like that might be able to give another point of view that's tries to be a little more down the center of it. I don't know. That's my thought. All right. What do we got next? What's the next question?
Yeah. This another one from Reload member Paul. And he's asking about any ideas on how to harness the growing I'm assuming he's talking about the liberal gun owners / liberal gun club type community. So some of these folks from outside the quote unquote traditional gun culture spaces, to better inform them about, knowledge about guns. If, maybe perhaps it's similar to this question. If perhaps their only understanding of guns comes from sort of mass media, typical, outside of gun culture knowledge. So what do you think about Paul's question there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I kind of took it as him asking how to use folks from the liberal gun owning community to educate people. But I don't know. Maybe Paul can send a clarification to us. But I guess you could look at it both ways. Yeah, I mean, one is like the Liberal Gun Club itself does, I think, a pretty good job of explaining its views to its members, right, and educating people on gun rights, in addition to what their rights are, in addition to like the benefits of gun ownership, as well as like more practical questions around training and then just like camaraderie and things like that. But then as far as like one thing I've always noticed about the Liberal Gun Club, and this sort of fits into the idea that we have a lot of new gun owners and they're from backgrounds that haven't traditionally owned guns at a high rate, whether it's people who are ideologically to the left or people who are, different kinds of minority groups in the United States or women. If we're seeing more of this kind of gun owner come in, one advantage is that for the movement, I guess, for the gun rights movement, is that they can sort of speak to groups that the movement hasn't done a good job of reaching to this point. And so they have an advantage in being able to, have a shared background or a shared worldview with people who don't like firearms or don't agree with a lot of gun rights arguments. And so maybe they can talk to them in a more persuasive way. This is something that, the hope, I think, long-term would be that for these groups is that they can reach, for instance, elected officials, Democrats who are hostile to gun owners or gun rights. And they can talk to them in a way that is more likely to persuade them than, other gun rights groups have been able to do that. And that's something that I know the Liberal Gun Club does, is they will lobby lawmakers in ways that I think are potentially more persuasive. Obviously the thing with any group like that's doing activism, from our perspective as reporters, is that, you need to show results, right? For this, the idea sounds good, but delivering is what matters in the end. And so how much these new gun owners and groups like the Liberal Gun, they're not the only ones, right? There's a lot of groups out there now that focus on trying to make new gun owners from different backgrounds more comfortable when they're at the range or when they're training. A Girl on a Gun is a good example of something like that. National African American Gun Association. There's a number of groups out there that serve this sort of purpose. And so, I think that helps probably overall the gun owning community in the United States, which is huge, right? Like Gallup has it at 44% report having a gun in the home. I think the University of Chicago has it at 46. NBC News says 51% of voters have a gun in the home. These are huge numbers of people. And so you'd expect there to be quite a lot of different viewpoints inside of that group. Even if that does still skew towards more conservative, rural, white guys, it's less and less skewing that direction. So, that's how I look at it, as far as like the Liberal Gun Club type groups can help reach and inform people outside of that sort of conservative right-wing bubble of people who already agree with gun rights arguments anyway, for the most part.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's kind of how I see it. It's like, it's sort of like an ambassador role, where you people outside of gun culture can feel more like they may have more of a place in gun culture, or maybe become more, to use a term I used in the last question, gun curious, because they see people that, I agree with you on XYZ, whether it's ideology in the case of the liberal gun owners, or you come from a similar background to me in the case of some of these more, ethnic minority related gun groups. And then that becomes sort of an ambassadorship into gun ownership, because they see that, it's not just traditional gun culture, like you talked about. So I agree.
Yeah. And then I guess for our final question, we have one from a member named Brett, who, this is a question about Donald Trump and, critical view of him as far as, Brett talks a lot here about how essentially Trump has made favorable comments towards strongmen and authoritarians like Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un or any number of dictators throughout his time as a politician. He's talked about wanting to be a dictator, at least on day one. He's made a lot of these these sort of comments, including about, retribution. This is stuff that I had mentioned during the campaign that was scary rhetoric that, makes me uncomfortable and unnerved for sure, and probably a lot of other people as well. But not everybody, and I'll get to why that is perhaps here. But he's talked about this desire to, or at least he's spoken of his admiration for some of these authoritarian leaders and how they're able to act very strongly, as he will often put it, and then has, like I said, talked about wanting to be a dictator for a day at least. And so Brett's question is, given all of that, do you really think he's going to follow through on promises to support the Second Amendment? Historically, dictators have considered an armed populace as a threat. Why would Trump be different if that's really his view on how he wants to govern? And, this is a very fair question in my mind. Like, you look at Trump's rhetoric on some of this stuff, and it does sound like exactly the kind of things that most gun rights people would be very uncomfortable with and very upset about if it was coming from a different kind of candidate. I just think that's frankly true. But in this time, it's coming from the candidate that they are aligned with, that has promised to do the things that they want done. And so you don't get nearly as much pushback either from the gun rights groups themselves or from gun voters, frankly. I mean, there was not a lot. You didn't see like a groundswell of support for any other candidate during the primary, even within the ostensibly pro-gun party, right? The Democratic Party doesn't really offer a strong alternative for gun voters, for people who vote based on gun rights and gun policy. They are still much more aligned with the gun control groups and voters who prioritize that. And even Harris, when she was talking about owning a Glock and so forth, didn't really move at all on policy to try and appeal to disaffected gun voters. But there's not really a lot of evidence that there were a lot of disaffected gun voters, right? Because, for instance, Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, had done a number of pro-gun reforms in the lead up to the primary that seemed to be setting up an argument for, why he'd be a better alternative on the policy on guns than Trump, who has a pretty mixed record as president. He instituted the bump stock ban while also appointing pro-Second Amendment judges to both the federal courts and the Supreme Court, right? So, but you didn't see DeSantis actually try to take advantage of that distinction. I guess whether this was right or not, they did not seem to believe that it would give them an advantage and that gun voters were going to leave Trump for him. So, you haven't really seen an abandonment of Trump by either gun rights groups or gun voters. That's just the practical reality of it, I think, whatever you view, whether you think that's the correct calculation to make or not, it's reality. And I think one of the reasons is that people just don't really believe that he's going to do some of the stuff he talks about. This is a classic dynamic with Donald Trump going back to 2015, 2016. You're supposed to take him seriously, but not literally, which has always struck me as just like you get to pick and choose which things you want to like that he says. And I think that a lot of people do. Not that that's unique to Donald Trump. A lot of people do that with a lot of politicians, but it's certainly a defining feature of Donald Trump as a politician. People will pick and choose what they want to take seriously about the things he says. And for a lot of gun voters, I think they want to take the promises on gun policy seriously. And you can look at his actual track record, and that's something. Now, is he going to be exactly the same as he was the first time around? Probably not, but it's hard to predict which direction he's going to go off in. Whether it's, we had a story about his latest AG, Pam Bondi, and her mixed record on gun policy. She became a pretty staunch advocate for red flag laws after Parkland, but so did Donald Trump himself, right? The difference with Bondi is that Florida actually passed a red flag law that she defended in court, and Trump didn't actually get a red flag law passed at the national level. I guess the question becomes, how much do you take seriously the sort of darker things he said during the campaign, and how much of that do you chalk up to bluster or mean tweets? It's often how a lot of Trump supporters will rationalize this stuff. I just don't like the mean tweets or what have you, but I like the policies that he did. And so, he appointed pro-gun Supreme Court justices. He didn't pass a lot of very significant new gun control legislation, right? I mean, he did the bump stock ban, but that's not something that affects most gun owners. And so a lot of them maybe don't care as much about that as and don't see much of an alternative in the Democratic Party as well, as another issue at stake there. But yeah, I mean, as far as like predicting what Donald Trump will do, I think it's very difficult to say. That's one of his defining features, that his presidency was fairly chaotic. He would say stuff and do different things. Yeah. So as far as like, I can't sit here and say, oh, he's absolutely going to send the military out to go and arrest Nancy Pelosi or something, even though he said he would do that, or he's going to become a dictator on day one, because one, he doesn't have the constitutional authority to do something like that to begin with. And whether he would even try is, I think, unlikely, not impossible. I don't know what to say about it. It's hard to predict. I try to just go off of what has been and how his track record is, rather than just trying to guess based on things he says. I guess that's the bottom line for me, is like, I don't like a lot of the stuff that he has said. And I said that before the election. And that's just my personal view on it. But as far as I'm not going to be somebody who sits here and says he's absolutely going to do this bad thing or this good thing. I don't really know what he's going to do. We can look at his record and we can try to guess on that, and you can factor in stuff he says. But one of the things to factor in about stuff he says is that he doesn't often do the things he says he's going to do. I mean, his big promise in the first election was that he was going to build the wall across the border with Mexico and make them pay for it. And he didn't do either of those things. He built some small portions or updated some of it, but Mexico didn't pay for it. Like, this is just, I don't know, directionally, you can maybe take something away from what he says, but the specifics of it is hard to predict. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, all that is true. I also think some of the bigger risk of his wild cardness, for lack of a better term, on the Second Amendment comes not so much from his authoritarian flirtations, but more from his populism. This is sort of in a vein that you actually wrote a piece for the Dispatch sort of alluding to this, where he's a little bit of a weather vane. If he feels like suddenly it's politically advantageous to pass gun control, he kind of tends to do that. You saw this after Parkland, and then later when he purportedly flirted with an assault weapon ban, because he had this sense that, the people want action, and I am the tribune of the people, as the populist that he is, and therefore I'm going to try to pursue that. And now he was talked off that ledge by the NRA, who was much stronger at the time, and he was also a first-term president. He's no longer.
The first impeachment happened,
and then the first impeachment also derailed that. He no longer has. The NRA is not in the same position it once was politically. He's essentially a lame duck president. He doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. Right. You might see some changes. It should a mass shooting or some other tragedy happen that sort of changes the political mood around guns. I think that's a more likely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real risk of his presidency, especially a presidency where he has control, his party has control of both houses, because I think he's much more likely to move Republicans to support some sort of gun control bill than Kamala Harris would have been able to.
Yeah.
Although
definitely,
you're already seeing, like, he put up Matt Gaetz as his first AG nominee, and the Republican Senate rejected that. So it's not a guarantee that he's going to go one way or the other. I think it's
a good point.
When I look at it, most likely thing I would, if I'm predicting stuff, and maybe my predictions are hopeful because I would like to see stability more than I would like to see chaos. And, I think he legitimately doesn't like Joe Biden. He doesn't like that he lost to him last time. He will probably do the things that he said he was going to undo when it comes to the Biden administration's gun policies, which were mostly done through executive action and federal rulemaking. So he can undo most of those. You did a whole piece on this that looked at what he can and can't really do just on his own. And, he'll probably get rid of the ATF director that Biden appointed. I don't know what he'll do in terms of if he even will try to appoint another one or not. We'll have to see. And a lot of this stuff is just like, I don't want to get too far out over my skis. I don't know that he's going to be, the worst possible version of himself or the best possible version of himself. He'll probably fall somewhere in the middle of that. And what that means for gun policy, I don't know. I would look more towards the people further down the line that are going to have a more direct impact, because I don't know that Trump is going to pay very close attention to gun policy. It's not one of the things that animates him generally. The only time, other than he wants gun owners to vote for him, that's clear. So, but yeah, like you said, he can't run again. So I don't know how that plays out. And then he's been animated in the aftermath of major mass shootings to look at least supporting further gun restrictions, but hasn't actually followed through on that beyond the bump stock ban. So what does that mean for the next 4 years? I really honestly just don't know. We'll have to see. I don't want to be like, I would rather follow along and report on what's happening than try to predict everything. These are my thoughts. This is our stream of consciousness bit here at the end. I don't know is the bottom line. I cannot guarantee you that something wild won't happen one way or the other on gun policy under Donald Trump. I just can't. What I can do is say, look at what he's done, look at what he says, try to form that into a guess at where he's going. And then more importantly, look at what his actions actually are coming in here. Like, what does him picking Pam Bondi mean for gun policy? I don't really know, other than that she's extremely loyal to him and will probably just I don't know that I don't think she's necessarily she's supported red flag laws. I don't think it's because out of principle necessarily. I think she just did that for politics. And I think she would do what Trump wants her to do for the most part. So, what does that translate to for gun policy? I don't know. I just don't know yet. We'll see. We're going to ask lots of much smarter people than me who are much better connected and get their insights as we go along here. But it's going to be 4 years of this stuff. He's not president yet. He isn't doing anything yet. We'll see what happens when he's in there and what he actually does. But all right, that's all we've got for this week. Hopefully you guys had a good Thanksgiving. We're filming this a little before Thanksgiving, so we can have an actual Thanksgiving ourselves. But hopefully yours went well. And we'll be back to the normal schedule next week. I guess this will come out on Monday for most people. So on Friday, you'll be getting a news update again. We didn't do one for this week, but we will get back to that as soon as possible. And I hope you have a good Thanksgiving there, Jake. I hope it goes well and you have a good time, and that you eat a lot of really good food.
I'm planning on it, and same to you.
Thanks, man. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.